What does it mean to describe God as one who hides his face from us, as we see in Isaiah chapter 8, verse 17? Welcome to Theology Sabbath School, a ministry of the School of Theology on the campus of Walla Walla University. I'm Carl Cosart, the Dean of the School of Theology and the host of Theology Sabbath School. Today we're continuing our study of the book of Isaiah, and we've come to an interesting passage, Isaiah chapter 8, a chapter that falls in the context of the challenges Israel is experiencing with the Assyrians. And to help us with this passage, I've invited Dr. Jody Washburn to join me for this conversation. So Dr. Washburn, thank you again for joining us at Theology Sabbath School, and maybe we could just jump in and have you kind of give us some context. I briefly mentioned we're here with the Assyrians again, but can you tell us chapter 8, how does it fall into the immediate context of what's taking place in the book of Isaiah?
Yeah, so overall, the book of Isaiah, especially the beginning part, is kind of divided into two parallel sections. I appreciate how the Bible Project kind of lumps them together to show the parallels, and they point out that Isaiah 1 through 12 essentially talks in all different ways about judgment and hope for Jerusalem. And then when we get into the next section, 13 to 27, you have a parallel discussion of judgment and hope, but this is for the nation, so a much broader lens. And these chapters that we're looking at here are essentially, I guess, situated in the context of the issues that Judah faced during the period of increasing Assyrian incursions into the land, and then the local kingdoms trying to decide, like trying to strategize, what would be the wisest way forward to protect our kingdom, our people. So we have an issue where Judah is not seeing eye to eye with the other small kingdoms nearby. So Israel, for instance, and the next kingdom to the north, the Arameans or the Syrians, they want to band together all, right, to fight against the Assyrians, and they actually cause quite a bit of trouble for the southern kingdom, for Judah, because Judah decides they do not want to band together at that point, and they kind of cast their bets elsewhere. So this is a complicated time where each king of each of these little kingdoms is trying to be strategic. And within that context, the repeated message of the prophets is no matter how strategic you are, you cannot guarantee that you can control the future, the outcomes, right? There are powers at work here beyond what you can control. And in this little section, starting in chapter 7 that I believe you talked about last week, and then moving into chapter 8, we have fascinating use of children as symbols of this message, of God's hand at work in history, of the unfolding of that, and how the kings of each kingdom cannot necessarily control the outcomes. And then also this ongoing, unfolding hope that may not actually be realized during the lifetime of those people.
And those certainly are really interesting names that Isaiah gives to his children. Names have meaning, but I think that's really uncharacteristic for typical names in Judea, right? Is that exactly, am I on the right track with that?
I think names generally have meaning. I think what stands out to me, many times for us today, we think of names more as just we like the way they sound, right? Or the ring, or they have a significance to us. But in the Bible, it's pretty common for someone's name to have a literal meaning that's somehow connected to their story. But some of these stand out. Like, it's one thing, Emmanuel, right? That's one thing to have a word that means a phrase in Hebrew, like God with us. But this other one, I think you're referring to the 4-word one, right? Maher Shalal Hashbaz. That's quite a phrase. All these words strung together that would translate into multiple phrases in Hebrew. And I think that does stand out.
Yeah, that wasn't a trick to see if you could actually pronounce all 4 words. But it's a mouthful, isn't it? But it is interesting to talk and to see God's timing connected to these young children in relationship to Syria in the north and then also the nation of Israel. But to go back to our earlier question, our leading question about God hiding his face, and that's a phrase that I think we see here, of course, in verse 17. But it's kind of a strange passage, I guess. In my mind, at least, to think God of hiding his face, I've heard it before, but in reality, God doesn't really have a face, does he? I mean, God is described in, the arm of the Lord, but God is more than just a physical being that has a face and an arm like us. So what do we make of this terminology in Scripture, particularly here in verse 17, that describes God in these, anthropological type of forms?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, it truly is part of a huge constellation of anthropomorphic, wording, imagery used to try to talk about the divine and get at something that really humans cannot fully understand, right? With our senses, the idea in the Hebrew Bible is that this God is somehow beyond our realm and yet intimately involved. And the overall phrase, I ran across a scholar who talked about it. So in scholarship, in Judaism, and even many Old Testament scholars outside of Judaism, the phrase is used hester panim. It means like the hiding of the face, and usually is in reference to God. And it comes up throughout the Hebrew Bible. And this particular scholar pointed out that this is a metaphor, and that metaphors are intrinsically limited and somewhat problematic when they're used in theological discussions, right? Because a metaphor is transferring the connotations of one realm onto another, and if we try to take that and make a complete picture, we can easily lose the idea that this is a metaphor. It's one image that gives us one part of a much bigger picture. And that's not just I don't just mean that it's part of a constellation of metaphors about like using kind of physical images like hands and heads and all of this to talk about God. I also mean that even within the Hebrew Bible description of various aspects of God's relation with humanity, so you could call it the hiddenness, the silence of God, perceived inaction. In all of these realms, this is an ongoing theme that is dealt with in various ways by different texts within the Hebrew Bible. And even within that conversation, this phrase, hester panim, the hiding of the face of God, is only one of many images and kinds of language used to wrestle with that. So that's important to keep in mind.
I guess it makes me think too, and maybe you can correct me if I'm mistaken here, but I think we also have passages in Scripture that talk about, may the Lord let his face, look upon you or shine upon you. Am I getting that right?
Yes, that's a great point too, to connect it to things that we're very familiar with. Like, for instance, the priestly blessing that I think you're referencing would be an example of the positive connotations of God turning his face toward people. And then if we want to think about what satar means in Hebrew, the hiding or concealing, an example would be to think of the story of Esther. This is a book in the Hebrew Bible where God is never explicitly mentioned, so God is essentially sort of hidden or concealed in the narrative, but implied in various places. And then even Esther herself, she takes on that name. It's not her given name. Esther takes on that name, and it essentially means I will hide. And if you know the story, right, part of what makes Esther able to do the work that she does is that she does hide. She hides her identity. And so that would be a way for us to think in terms of what that wording means. And I would say overall, if you look for patterns, there are a number of them that we could point out, but one of the sort of repeated meanings of the phrase, the hiding of the face, has to do with the opposite of what you mentioned. So if God's face turning towards you means like sustenance and blessing and life and having plentiful resources, then the opposite of that is that when God hides his face, people experience like death, right? Lack of flourishing, not enough resources. And there are a few, I'm trying to think if I can tell you specific examples, like particularly in Psalms 104 and 143, there are references there where the parallelism almost shows that this, like when God hides his face, we experience it like death, like going into Sheol, the underworld, like returning to the dust.
You know, several years ago I was in Israel leading a tour, and we were there for the celebration of Purim. And so we went to one of the synagogues there in Jerusalem, and that was a fascinating experience. It brought back this idea of the hiding of the face and the story of Esther, of course, which is tied to Purim. But to me it was surprising because when we got to the synagogue, I mean, everyone there were wearing what I would call Halloween masks. They were dressed up in all kinds of crazy masks. And it was like, I struggled with that at first. It's like, well, you know, this is strange. But for them, it's this idea, as you said, of the hiding of the face. And I really like that connection to the book of Esther. I never thought of that in connection to her name, Esther, also being a hidden, you know, reality of who she is. And that's an interesting way to talk about, you know, the unseen aspect of God. I just think that's an interesting connection. You know, I wonder if we can call on and talk about this next passage in the book of Isaiah chapter 8, after verse 17, where it brings up this word again of fear, that there's a call to not fear like the people are fearing, but then a call to fear. So can you talk a little bit about this word fear and really what that means and what's going on with this passage?
Yeah, no, this is a fascinating text, and I think I'll go ahead and read these two verses that you've alluded to in their entirety, just to show the contrast that's being drawn here. So I'm looking specifically at Isaiah 8, verses 12 and 13. So do not call conspiracy everything this people calls a conspiracy. Do not fear what they fear, and do not dread it. The Lord Almighty is the one you are to regard as holy. He is the one you are to fear. He is the one you are to dread. And then it goes on in an interesting way to talk about him being the holy place for the people. But this essentially is a really explicit example of the two sides of the idea of fear. This is described by some people when they talk about the idea of wonder. So social scientists today, when they research wonder, they measure people's behavior and stress hormones and a number of other things in response to experiences of wonder. And oftentimes they have found that when people experience awe or amazement, wonder, right, that sense that you're bumping into something bigger than yourself, it can elicit feelings of terror. So think like standing too close to the pounding water of Niagara Falls or something like that. It can also elicit feelings of amazement or like being drawn toward. And in many respects, what social scientists explain as, for instance, one person researching this used the same exact thing. He used this example where he showed people images of colored ink being tossed into droplets of milk and then slowing the image way down and seeing all the colors and everything going together. And you wouldn't think, like, that's so strange that that would elicit in us this feeling of awe, this experience of wonder. But in the biblical text, you have these repeated descriptions of people encountering this God, right? And there's two aspects of the wonder. There's the abject fear, like, do not let us see him. You go, Moses, right? You go and see him, and we'll just come talk to you afterward. We don't want to get too close. But there is also the amazement, the awe, the experience of wonder that draws people in, right, into relationship, into ongoing encounter with this God. And here in Isaiah, we seem to be getting an allusion to both of those aspects of wonder in relation to God, and then also an allusion to a false, like what would you call it? A counterfeit fear, where you're fearing things that there's no need to fear in the big picture when realizing that the God you are engaging with is the creator, the source and sustainer. And I just find it interesting, the phrasing, like the word that's used in verse 13, it is from the root word fear in Hebrew, but it's like a noun that essentially means awe. And in some other instances in Isaiah, you have something along the lines of like, don't fear me, as in just reciting rote phrases that you think will like get a response, a positive response from God. No, fear as in stand in awe. And so it seems like when he says that he is the one you should fear, it's drawing on, you don't need to be in abject terror in the face of these foreign incursions, because this is not the end of the story. And at the same time, you also don't need to fear that at the same level that you would experience awe or fear in the presence of this God who is the source and sustainer, right? Don't compare these as if they're apples and oranges. We're talking about two totally different categories. So, and these are, if you want to search this, you can look up these words using a concordance tool or something and kind of trace them throughout the prophetic writings. It's fascinating.
Well, it makes me wonder, because I mean, I can understand, and I would agree with you from a cognitive perspective. But at the same time, I look at this passage, and it really kind of stumps me, because this is the call, don't fear what they fear and don't dread what they dread. Yet, I mean, if I would look at the situation politically at that time with Assyria in the north, and Syria and Israel, on my northern border immediately, I think this is really hard. I mean, it's one thing to say, oh yeah, I would totally have the right perspective, but Ahaz had some concern. So I guess I can maybe, this sounds bad, I can identify with Ahaz in that situation. How do we have those right values and the right perspective on fear when you're dealing with truly genuine concerns, I guess? That's an open-ended question. I don't know if you have any answer for that, but I guess I'm just trying to identify with the people and why they would have been concerned at that point in time.
Yeah, I mean, my immediate answer is just to say, that's why we're still reading the Bible 2,500 years later, is that these texts are, they're articulating, they're putting a spotlight on our human experience. And I would say, when I read those repeated phrases in Isaiah, do not fear, do not fear, do not fear, do not be afraid, do not fear, it takes me back to Exodus, where you have those fascinating passages in the middle part of Exodus when the people are leaving, right? They're being delivered from Egypt. And you have one section where it seems like God basically told them to back themselves into a corner, like they went out on a peninsula and they're surrounded on every side. They have nowhere to go, and the Pharaoh and his armies are coming, and God essentially calls out and he says, be still, like stand, do not be afraid. And it's like in that waiting or standing or taking a breath in the midst of like crisis, not imagined crisis. Like, your point is well taken. This is not imagined crisis. This is real crisis, like impending doom that you can see coming down on you. So over and over again in the biblical text, we see examples of this where in the midst of crisis, the people are asked to stop, to be still, to take a breath, in a way, remember that God is the one who gives that breath every time we take it. And in the midst of crisis, people are asked to pause, take that remembering breath, and somehow remember that even when you're in the crisis, right, and it's a very real crisis, when you're in the crisis and you do not see a way forward, you don't see any possible sort of ideal or positive outcome, it looks bad, that right in the midst of that, when you pause, in a way, you're defying the idea that this is the end of the story. You're joining this chorus of voices, this kind of collection of testimonies that we find in the Bible, that this is not the end of the story, that the perception of God's distance and silence and inactivity is not the end of the story.
Your reply was well put, which is that's why we're still reading these texts today. It isn't that the message? I mean, time and time again, it's do not fear, do not fear, do not fear. Our life is fragile, our life is limited, and we tend to fear quite easily. And looking at this passage again about God hiding his face, when I thought about it initially, I kind of envisioned it as God hiding his face from Ahaz. But as I'm looking at the passage right now, it seems like it's not just God hiding his face from Ahaz, but in the perspective of what's happening in Judah, God's face seems to be hidden. And it seems, and you can correct me again, it seems even to be hidden from Isaiah. At least that's my inclination here, at least from the English, which is when Isaiah says in verse 16 or 17, I will wait for the Lord who's hiding his face from the house of Jacob, and I will hope in him. So it seems like to me that Isaiah is describing in a very real sense that life is difficult, the circumstances are pressing, but it's how do you relate to God at those times when there's no visible, physical, nice, warm, fuzzy sense of God's presence, when all hell seems to break loose. What kind of decisions do we make? Where does our religion, where does our faith in God come into play at that time? I'm just curious, do you think that's the case, or is it more one-sided than that?
Yeah, I think so. I think there is substantial evidence, if we trace this theme throughout the Hebrew Bible and even beyond, that the idea of the hiddenness of God hiding his face, of silence, of inactivity, that this is one of the ways. So it's this phrase is used in multiple ways, but one of the patterns, one of the repeated ways that it's used is kind of like that, like a description of the human condition or the human experience of the divine. I think I mentioned earlier that the metaphor of God having a face and then turning it away from us, it's a limited metaphor. It's inadequate, right? It doesn't give us a complete picture of God and how he relates to people, or even of his perceived silence. But it does give us a picture that then I think it can have some theological implications that apply to everyone, not just people who are like blatantly stepping outside of God's will or ideal or design, but everyone. And the part of that I think is worth noting is the idea that like this language, God's hiddenness, the hidden face of God. This language gives voice to the idea that there is an essential part of God that is not understood, cannot be seen by, with human senses, cannot be understood, apprehended by human senses. And in a way, a lot of the points in the Hebrew Bible wouldn't have the same power that they have if this wasn't the case. So one Jewish author that I was reading was saying that very point, that if God was not hidden, right? If this hiddenness of God was not a thing in the Hebrew narrative, then in essence there wouldn't be any revelation. There wouldn't be breaking through that hiddenness to initiate relationship, to reveal his character, etc. And so, you mentioned the prophet also experiencing God as hidden, as well as Ahaz and other figures along the way. And that's a point well taken, that the idea that God is somehow outside of our immediate realm is what allows for this breakthrough, these revelations to come, and that initiation of God, God initiating relationship is what makes the stories so beautiful that come up over and over.
I think what I really liked, the phrase, you mentioned it twice, and I think it's worth repeating a third time. And I never really thought about it in the way you said it, but if there was no hiddenness to God, if there wasn't this sense of not seeing him, that there would be no revelation. And to me, that's it's just a profound point, that it's because of God's distance that he's chosen to reveal himself to us. And just because he's distant does not mean that his presence is still not there. Doesn't mean that, it just means we're unaware of it, we don't see it. And I guess that makes me think of two instances, two connections that come to my mind. Is one, now it's been since 2006, when we lost our daughter Mindy when she had turned 16 and drowned through tragic circumstances in the Wenatchee River. And for us, that was a time of real darkness. It's just, I couldn't understand why and the how and where was God, how could this happen? And as I tried to figure that out, and I've really not really ever figured it out, and I don't think I will this side of eternity, but it just seemed like, where was God and why was he not there? And I could so clearly see his actions before that event in my life, and I've seen it afterwards. But that's a time when it seems like his face, his presence is one that's hidden. And that leaves me with a choice on how to relate, to trust or to turn away. And I've chosen to trust. And one thing that's helped me as I've gone through that experience, and certainly I don't have all the answers, but to think that Jesus faced a similar experience on the cross. He cries out in the Gospel of Mark, my God, why have thou forsaken me? And so Jesus even had this sense of the hiddenness of God and how to relate. And he chose, of course, in the end, not to surrender his faith, but to die, confident and trusting that God would see him through the situation that he was in. And so that helps me kind of relate that it's not just, people 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago, I guess, who've had these same challenges and concerns, but we experienced them, each of us in our own lives, and certainly Jesus experienced it in the Garden of Gethsemane and then ultimately on the cross as well.
Yeah, and it's an ongoing struggle. I'm just thinking back what your personal example that you shared made me think about how sometimes having a history of interaction, like where we perceive that we act, we make decisions, and God responds, right? This is part of the whole narrative of the Hebrew Bible. The people cry out in their affliction and God hears. So once you build up a history of that, right? The idea that I cry out, God responds, God redeems, God reaches out to deliver, God is present with. I think that it can make those experiences of crisis where you can't see a way forward, even it fills them with more anguish. like the more of a history that you have, the more regular and predictable God's connection and sustenance and protection has been in the story, then perhaps correspondingly, the more God's absence or the perceived absence of God becomes this element that just brings deep angst. And you mentioned the lament tradition, Jesus saying this lament poem from the cross, and one of the profound elements of lament in the Hebrew Bible is that these poems are addressed to God, the very figure that these same poems confront for hiding, right? For being uninvolved, for allowing these terrible tragedies to unfold. And so in a way, the prophet Isaiah is experiencing that sort of, standing in the middle. So relationship with God, relationship, seeing the disasters that are unfolding and realizing I can relate to this God even in the midst of not seeing an outcome, not seeing a way out. And I don't know, I think we're confronted with those questions over and over. Are we going to see these moments as evidence that God is causing some kind of harm to us by turning his face? Or are we going to see it as an opportunity to experience God as being in pain or feeling sorrow, or the phrase, his heart is broken like a father, or seeing the crises that humanity faces at any given time. I love that strand of Jewish interpretation of this phrase, the idea of the hiddenness of God, the strand that says we don't have to see it as God turning his face and causing the crisis, that we can also see it as God's heart being broken by our pain, and this is a way to make it through. And in Isaiah, I love the verse in chapter 30, which kind of matches with these sections that we're looking at in Isaiah 7 and 8, because it's another conversation having to do with false political alliances. So looking for security by maneuvering your political alliances. And in that text, you have the single instance in the whole Bible where God is waiting. So you mentioned Isaiah saying, I will wait on this God who hides his face, and I will hope in him. And in chapter 30, you have God, the personal God, Yahweh, God of Judah, being described as waiting. So in a way, just like we could say we're called to emulate Jesus and his embodiment of this clinging to relationship with God even when you don't see a way forward through the lament tradition, Isaiah in a way is articulating this idea that when we wait, even in the face of tremendous despair and crisis, that we are in a way emulating what this personal God has already shown us or modeled for us.
No, that makes sense entirely. In fact, that even makes sense of that passage. I think is in verse 19 where it talks about the soothsayers, the mediums, necromancers. And again, I think it reverts back to the issue of when we don't recognize God's presence, when all hell seems to be breaking loose, we can't make sense of our life, where do we turn for answers? And the correct answer here is that we should turn to God in those times and put our faith and hope and trust in him. Dr. Washburn, our time really has already come to an end. I want to thank you for these profound thoughts. We focused not on a lot, not on many chapters, one chapter and just a few verses, but I know it's helped make it more clear to me the relevancy of this passage for us today as we go through similar experiences as that of Isaiah and the children of Judah some 3,000 or more years ago. Also want to thank you, our viewers, for tuning in again with us. Invite you to join us again next week as we turn to some fascinating passages in Isaiah chapter 9 and chapter 11 the good news of a child who'd be the one who would bring hope, an individual who would sit on the throne of David. So I hope you can join us next week as we continue our study in the book of Isaiah. Until then, thanks for watching. Take care. God bless. Bye-bye.